a little bit about our guest, Michael Mundaca, who is the Assistant Treasury Secretary for Tax Policy. He's worked at the Treasury Department during the Clinton administration, during the Bush administration, and now during the Obama administration. He spent several years at Ernst & Young, and his specialty in some regards is international taxation. He has several degrees, a bachelor's in philosophy and physics from Columbia, a master's in philosophy from the University of Chicago. He went west for his law degree from UC Berkeley, and he has a LLM in taxation from the University of Miami. Michael Mundaca is Assistant Secretary of the Treasury for Tax Policy. Thank you for being on the Newsmakers.
Peter, thanks for the invite. Work Week Congress and an agenda that will be packed over the next few weeks before members leave for the October campaign break. And Colin Kahl will be joining us to talk about U.S. efforts in Iraq and also efforts now underway between Palestinian and Israeli negotiators in the Middle East as Secretary of State Hillary Clinton travels to the region this week. Part of our conversation tomorrow morning on the Washington Journal. Thanks very much for being with us on this Sunday. Enjoy the rest of your weekend. Hope you have a great week ahead.
Next, Newsmakers with Michael Mundaca, Assistant Treasury Secretary for Tax Policy. Then town hall meetings with Senator Tom Coburn, Senator Bernie Sanders, and Congressman Joe Bonner.
Well, much of the political and policy discussion of the last week has been about tax policy and whether or not to extend the tax cuts under George W. Bush's administration. Joining us this week on Newsmakers, Michael Mundaca, who is the Assistant Treasury Secretary for Tax Policy. Here to question him, Kim Dixon of Reuters and Martin Vaughn of Dow Jones. Mr. Vaughn, first question.
Thank you, Peter. Michael, I want to start out by asking you about the proposals that the President put forward, the tax proposals to stimulate the economy. One of those was he wanted to allow businesses to immediately write off 100% of their new equipment purchases in 2011, the aim being to free up cash for companies to invest and hire. What we're told from a lot of business leaders and economists is that the cash isn't the problem. The issue right now is that folks are worried about the economy not getting better, demand continuing to stagnate or even getting worse. In that light, how much good can you do by simply offering people tax cuts if they're just worried about the economy not getting better?
Thanks, Martin. That's a good question. I think we need to put this in context. These aren't one-off proposals. These are building on the proposals that the President has made and seen enacted over the last almost 2 years at this point, starting with the Recovery Act just a month into the administration, and then more recently the HIRE Act, and more recently than that, aid to states. These proposals now, these targeted proposals with respect to investment here in the United States, are meant to pull some of the cash that's on the sidelines right now, that businesses are looking at investing. They have the cash to do so, and they're deciding whether or not to do so. And you're right, they're looking at a lot of different factors, including demand, the economy overall. What we're trying to do is incentivize them to invest right now by having this temporary targeted incentive with respect to capital purchases. Again, pull the investment they might otherwise make into a more short-term time frame. We do understand there's more to do. There's a lot to do to try to heal the damage done by this very, very deep recession. And again, these are steps that the President has announced in order to build on what he has already done and proposed.
Sense that we're getting from the Hill, from some lawmakers and aides, is that it's a pretty tight schedule and there might not be a lot of appetite for doing this right now. Is it still worth doing if Congress can't address it until the first part of next year? And would delaying it until then reduce the effectiveness of these proposals?
Again, Great question. Congress does have a lot on its plate. We understand that, and the priorities right now for them, and we support them, is first moving the small business bill. That's before the Senate's been held up for a while. That's the first order of business when they come back next week, and we hope that gets done quickly. Then they have to think about what to do on the Bush tax cuts. We understand that. Hopefully we'll have some agreement on both those issues, move swiftly, and then they can turn to the President's proposals just made this week. But those proposals weren't made with a specific time frame or calendar in mind. They're good policy, they're good proposals. If Congress can't get them in the next few weeks, they are still going to be good policy when Congress returns.
Can I pick up on that? Speaking of the Bush tax cuts, that is one of the big tax items that has to be dealt with by the end of the year. Former White House Budget Director Peter Orszag, came out recently talking about, in the interest of political expediency, maybe just looking at some temporary extension of all the tax cuts. What would be the harm of that?
And I understand Peter's point. He's making a political point, I think. I think what he wrote in the Times made it clear that he preferred extension only of the middle class tax cuts, not the high-end ones. We have a great legislative team at Treasury and at the White House. I'll leave the political strategy to them. The President's been very clear on the policy that the sound policy is to extend only the middle class tax cuts to lock into place, provide certainty with respect to 98% of individuals, small business owners who are facing a tax increase if these tax cuts are allowed to expire. And again, we simply cannot afford the tax cuts on the top 2%. Those should be allowed to expire as scheduled.
Could we afford to do it for 1 year? And if the choice is just doing it for 1 or 2 years versus some sort of deadlock in Congress like what happened last year with the estate tax, is there any room for compromise, do you think?
Again, the President's been clear. The better policy is to allow the high-end tax cuts to expire as scheduled. This talk of 1 year, 2 years, we think is a strategy for permanence. And Representative Boehner, in announcing his support for this 2-year extension, also made very clear he would continue to fight for permanence. So again, we see this as a strategy for permanence. We can't afford to have to borrow $700 billion in order to fund these tax cuts for the top 2% of Americans. They should be allowed to expire as scheduled.
But if it's a choice between, sorry, just one more follow-up. If it's a choice between a short-term extension and this gridlock and not getting anything done, it would be fairly bad for the economy to let those lower and middle-income tax cuts expire, right?
I hope we don't have to face that. There is agreement around extending the middle-class tax cuts. I hope we can coalesce around the very sound policy of doing that.
Michael Mundaca, just to go back to Martin Vaughan's first questions about the 100% expensing, et cetera, and the uncertainty that business owners and capital investments are facing, doesn't all this talk of 1 year, 2 years, doesn't this add to uncertainty in the tax code and thus may not be contributing positively to the economy?
That's a great point. And again, I think we have to distinguish between the uncertainty created because we can't get agreement around proposals as the uncertainty created by something else. We view the targeted temporary expensing as a measure to bring forward investment. It has to be temporary. The other proposal the President made with respect to the R&D credit, that's another proposal that is seeking to remove the uncertainty by taking out of the mix the year-to-year exercise we have to go through to reauthorize that credit. So I take your point, but on the expensing, it is temporary for a reason. The R&E credit is temporary just because of historical and political accident. That we need to make permanent. That's what the President is proposing. Remove the uncertainty, allow businesses to plan their R&D. Great jobs here in the U.S. created with respect to those activities to allow businesses to know that credit's going to be there and not face what they're facing this year, which is the credit's actually not there right now. It expired in 2009. We have to act to extend it to 2010. The President wants to take us off that path, make this permanent.
Next question.
Maybe just to go back to the Bush tax cuts and the policy on that, one of the questions is, how do you define middle class? And you know, the president had in the past defined that as a threshold of 200,000 or less, or for married couples 250,000 or less. Some Democrats on the Hill think that's too low, particularly in urban centers where someone's definition of the middle class might well be broader than a family making $250,000 a year. Are you rethinking that at all, or is the administration considering, you know, supporting raising that to 500,000 or even $1 million?
Again, the president's been clear in setting those thresholds at 200, 250, as you note, for extending the tax cuts, covers 98% of Americans. So I think it's a sound definition of what's middle class. People could actually come the other way back on us and say, how is it that 98% of Americans are middle class or below? But the president has been clear. That's where we think the tax relief should be delivered. It's based on a number of different factors and analysis, as the president has laid out, as Secretary Geithner has spoken about. There was a period of time recently in which the middle class, again defining up to 200 and 250, did not see their income increase near the level it had in the past and near the level that it was increasing for the very highest earners in the United States. We need to lock in the tax cuts for, again, 98% of Americans and allow the tax cuts on the top two to expire as scheduled.
But isn't that threshold pretty arbitrary? I mean, you know, the difference between a family living in Philadelphia and making $280,000 a year and someone, you know, living in, you know, rural Missouri or something like that at a $230,000 income. The standard of living, you know, it's not all about the income that you make.
That's right. And it's an important and deeper tax policy discussion we should have about whether there should be allowances for cost of living. Right now, I think for simplicity, we do have a system that applies across the country so that the income tax brackets, for example, apply with respect to income with no adjustment for where you live. So there are going to be some oddities in the lines that are drawn. There always are. It'd be very, very complex to say we're going to have our tax brackets and our tax rates key off the standard of living that and the cost of that standard of living across different areas of the United States. It is a good point. All these lines can be challenged, but again, the president set them based on analysis of where the income growth has stagnated. And again, we could be subject to criticism for setting them too high, but again, for the reasons you pointed out, that the middle class in certain parts of the country solidly in that band of 200 and 250.
Do you find yourself having, in the past month, more discussions? I know part of your job is working with people on Capitol Hill, more discussions with Democrats who are in tight election races and who might be worried about the tax cut issue. And if so, sort of how have you sort of addressed that? How have you convinced them that the president's position is the best position for the economy?
Luckily, I'm removed from a lot of the politics, so the discussions I have with staff are on a policy basis. We do understand the election realities, but in my job on the tax policy side, fortunately, I get to focus on the policy, not so much the politics.
Okay, on the R&D credit, the GAO came out with a report last year talking about how half of it went to really big companies that are in the Fortune 500 and how a lot of it was used to fund research and development that already would get done. What's the administration's thinking on that, and whether that could be just an extension of a corporate windfall?
It's a good question, and the credit itself, you know, as it's structured, does have an incremental element to it. Anytime you're trying to incentivize behavior, there is this issue, you know, economists call it buying out the base. What would otherwise happen, and what can you do to try to design the credit to get this incremental activity? The credit as designed currently has two general aspects to it. What the president has proposed to do is take the second, more simplified aspect that, again, does have this rolling incremental element to it, boost the benefit of choosing that form of the credit. Again, we hope it makes the credit work better. It makes the credit simpler if you choose that as opposed to the the original credit. And again,